Claire had always been close to her older brother David. They had a bond that I couldn't help but admire when we first started dating. It was the kind of connection that only siblings who had been through thick and thin together could have. They'd share inside jokes, finish each other's sentences, and laugh about things that I couldn't begin to understand. Over time, I'd grown to like David too. He was charming, quick-witted, and the kind of guy who could make anyone feel like they were his best friend. But as much as I appreciated his charisma, there was always a small part of me that felt uneasy around him. Maybe it was the way he always seemed to know what people were thinking, or how his presence had a way of filling the room, leaving everyone else in the shadows. When Claire suggested we visit him for the weekend, I agreed without hesitation. It had been a while since we'd spent time with him, and she seemed genuinely excited about the trip. "It'll be fun," she said, her eyes lighting up as she spoke. "David said he has new roommates, and they're all great. Plus, he promised to cook for us. You know how good his cooking is." I smiled, nodding along. Claire's enthusiasm was infectious, and even though the idea of spending a weekend with a group of strangers didn't exactly thrill me, I figured it wouldn't hurt to indulge her. Besides, it was only 2 days. What could go wrong in 2 days? David's house was tucked away at the edge of town, a sprawling old place that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the lawn was overgrown, and the front steps creaked ominously as we made our way up to the door. But there was something charming about it, a kind of rugged character that suited David perfectly. He greeted us with his usual warmth, pulling Claire into a bear hug before clapping me on the shoulder. "You made it," he said, grinning from ear to ear. "Come on in. I'll introduce you to everyone." Inside, the house was a hive of activity. Music played softly in the background, mingling with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. David's roommates, Luke, Sean, and Rachel, were gathered in the living room, each of them exuding a kind of magnetic energy that made it impossible to look away. Luke was tall and lean, with a sharp jawline and an easy smile that never quite reached his eyes. Sean was quieter, his piercing blue eyes seeming to miss nothing as he observed the room. And Rachel was confidence personified. She had a laugh that carried across the room, drawing attention wherever she went, and an air of authority that made it clear she was used to getting what she wanted. Claire fit in effortlessly. Within minutes, she was laughing and chatting with them like she'd known them for years. It was one of the things I loved about her, the way she could connect with anyone, no matter the situation. I hung back, nursing a beer and trying to keep up with the conversation. They were a tight-knit group, and it was clear they had a history that I wasn't a part of. But for Claire's sake, I did my best to join in, laughing at their jokes and chiming in when I could. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere grew more relaxed. David had a way of making everyone feel at ease, and soon we were all gathered around the living room, playing board games and sharing stories. It was fun, more fun than I'd expected, and for a while, I forgot about the unease that had been gnawing at me. But as the night progressed, I started to notice little things that didn't sit right. The way Luke would glance at Claire when he thought I wasn't looking. The way Rachel leaned in just a little too close when she laughed at something David said. The way Sean seemed to be watching everything, his gaze lingering on Claire for just a second too long. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, Claire was the kind of person who naturally drew people in. It wasn't unusual for people to gravitate toward her. But even as I tried to brush it off, the nagging feeling in the back of my mind refused to go away. It wasn't until later that night, when we were all gathered around the table for another game, that things took a turn. "Mark," David said, grinning mischievously, "we're out of snacks. You mind making a quick run to the store?" I hesitated, glancing at Claire. She smiled at me, her expression warm and encouraging. "It's fine," she said. "We'll be here when you get back." Reluctantly, I agreed. The store wasn't far, and I figured it wouldn't take more than 20 minutes. Still, as I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The drive to the store was uneventful, but the nagging sense of unease stayed with me. I tried to push it out of my mind, reminding myself that Claire was with David. If there was anyone I could trust to look out for her, it was him. When I returned, the house was eerily quiet. The music had been turned off, and the laughter that had filled the air earlier was gone. I called out as I stepped inside, but no one answered. My heart began to race as I made my way through the house, checking the living room, the kitchen, the dining room. All empty. It wasn't until I reached David's room that I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible, coming from the other side of the door. It was muffled, but unmistakable. Voices, laughter, and something else. My stomach turned as I tried the doorknob, only to find it locked. I knocked, my hand trembling slightly. David? Claire? Are you in there? No response. The voices on the other side of the door grew quieter, as if they were trying to keep me from hearing. Panic surged through me as I tried the knob again. Harder this time. Still locked. Desperation took over, and I bolted outside, my heart pounding as I circled around to the window. It was slightly ajar, and as I peered inside, my blood ran cold. As I pressed my face closer to the window, my hands gripping the frame, my mind raced with disbelief and anger. The scene unfolding inside was worse than anything I could have imagined. Claire was there, sitting on the edge of David's bed, but she wasn't alone. Luke was next to her, leaning in far too close, his hand resting casually on her thigh like it belonged there. Sean stood behind her, his hands brushing her shoulders, and Rachel lounged on the bed, laughing at something I couldn't hear. They weren't just sitting there talking. They were crowding her, closing in, their touches too familiar, too intimate. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what was happening. Claire wasn't resisting. If anything, she looked like she was enjoying the attention. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her hair falling over her shoulders in a way that made her look far too comfortable. Luke leaned closer, whispering something in her ear, and she laughed again, her hand resting lightly on his knee. My chest tightened as I watched Sean's hands move from her shoulders to her waist, his fingers brushing against the curve of her hips. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her head slightly, giving him a smile that made my stomach churn. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the window frame, my mind screaming at me to do something, to stop this before it went any further. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of what I was witnessing. These weren't strangers. These were people I had just spent the evening with, laughing and playing games like we were all friends. And now they were here, in David's room, treating Claire like she was theirs to touch, to claim, to share. Rachel leaned forward, her hand brushing against Claire's arm as she said something that made them all laugh. The sound was muffled through the glass, but it was enough to send a jolt of rage through me. How could Claire sit there and let this happen? How could she laugh and smile, like she wasn't betraying everything we had built together? My eyes darted to David, who was standing by the door, watching the scene with a smug expression that made my blood boil. He wasn't stopping them. He wasn't doing anything to protect his sister. If anything, he looked like he was enjoying the show. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to figure out what to do. I couldn't just stand there and watch. I had to act. I had to stop this. But the door was locked, and I couldn't barge in without making a scene. I glanced around the yard, my eyes landing on a small pile of tools near the garage. Without thinking, I grabbed a crowbar and hurried back to the window. If they weren't going to let me in, I would find another way. The sound of my footsteps must have alerted them, because the laughter inside grew quieter. I heard Claire's voice, sharp and nervous, followed by a low murmur from Luke. They knew I was there. They knew I was watching. My hands trembled as I wedged the crowbar under the window frame, prying it open with all the strength I could muster. The wood groaned in protest, but I didn't care. I needed to get inside. I needed to stop this nightmare from continuing. As the window finally gave way, I climbed inside, landing with a thud on the bedroom floor. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to me as I straightened up, my chest heaving with exertion and fury. What the hell is going on here? I demanded, my voice trembling with rage. Claire's face went pale, her eyes wide with shock and guilt. Luke leaned back slightly, his smug demeanor faltering for the first time. Sean crossed his arms, his expression unreadable, while Rachel raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a sly smile. "Mark," Claire began, her voice shaking. "It's not what it looks like." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. Don't you dare insult my intelligence with that line. I turned to David, who was leaning casually against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. And you, I said, my voice low and venomous. What the hell is wrong with you? How could you let this happen? David shrugged, a lazy smile playing on his lips. Relax, Mark. We were just having a little fun. Fun? I repeated, my voice rising. This is your idea of fun? Letting your friends grope my wife? Claire flinched at the harshness of my tone, her hands twisting in her lap. Mark, please, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Let me explain. Explain? I said, my fists clenching at my sides. Explain how you thought it was okay to sit here and let them touch you? To laugh and smile like this is some kind of joke? She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the floor. The room was thick with tension, the silence oppressive. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, of how things had spiraled so far out of control. Get up, I said finally, my voice cold and commanding. Claire looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. Mark, I said. Get up, I repeated, my tone leaving no room for argument. Slowly, she stood, her movements hesitant and uncertain. I turned to the others, my gaze hard and unyielding. All of you out. Now. For a moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, they filed out of the room, their expressions ranging from defiance to discomfort. David lingered by the door, his smirk still firmly in place. You're overreacting, he said, his tone laced with amusement. I took a step toward him, my fists clenched. Get out, I said through gritted teeth. He held my gaze for a moment longer before shrugging and walking away, leaving Claire and me alone in the room. I didn't burst into the room, and I didn't yell. My body wanted to. Every nerve in me screamed for justice, for confrontation, for release, but I stopped myself. Standing there at the edge of the window, I made a decision that surprised even me. I climbed back down the way I'd come, my hands trembling but steady enough to grip the edges of the siding. My heart was pounding as I hit the ground, my thoughts racing too fast to keep up with. I wasn't sure what I was feeling. Rage, humiliation, despair. But none of it mattered in that moment. What mattered was that I needed to think, to act smart. A confrontation here, now, would do nothing but expose me as the fool I'd already been made into. I wiped my hands on my jeans and took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. They didn't know I had been there, didn't know what I'd seen, and that was my only advantage. I circled back to my car, opening the driver's door and sitting there in silence, staring at the dashboard as the sound of my breathing filled the small space. I wasn't sure what to do next. My hands hovered over my phone, thinking about calling someone, Jake, maybe, or my lawyer. But no, it was too soon for that. I didn't even know the full story yet. All I had were fragmented pieces, an ugly mosaic that I still didn't fully understand. Claire had betrayed me, that much was clear. But why? And for how long? And what was David's role in all of this? I started the car and drove aimlessly, the sound of the engine humming in my ears as my mind raced with possibilities. By the time I reached the edge of town, I had a plan forming in my head. If I was going to deal with this, I needed to be smart about it. I needed proof, undeniable evidence that would leave no room for lies or manipulation. If Claire and David thought they could humiliate me, they were going to find out just how wrong they were. My first step was to go home, grab the spare key to the house, and install a camera in the guest room where David was staying. I knew it was risky, but the thought of letting them carry on under my nose was unbearable. If they wanted to play games, I'd play too, but I'd play to win. As I walked into the house, the silence was deafening. I moved quickly, heading straight to the closet where I kept the old security camera we'd used during renovations last year. It wasn't fancy, but it would do the job. I set it up in the corner of the guest room, hidden behind a stack of books on the shelf. If David thought he could use my home as his playground, he was in for a rude awakening. The next few days were agonizing. I went about my usual routine, pretending everything was normal while keeping a close eye on the camera feed. Claire acted like nothing had happened, smiling and chatting with me as if we were still the same happy couple we'd always been. But I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. Every time she laughed, every time she touched my arm or kissed my cheek, I felt a surge of anger and disgust. She was lying to my face, and I couldn't stand it. But I held my tongue, waiting for the right moment. It didn't take long for the feed to confirm my suspicions. 2 nights later, while I was supposedly out for a work dinner, the camera caught David sneaking into our bedroom. Claire was already there, dressed in a silk robe that made my stomach turn. They didn't waste any time, their conversation barely audible as they moved toward the bed. I couldn't bring myself to watch for long, my hands trembling as I hit the record button and closed the app. It was worse than I'd imagined, but it was the proof I needed. Now it was time to act. I spent the next day preparing, gathering every piece of evidence I could find. The security footage, the texts I'd recovered from Claire's phone, even receipts from suspicious transactions I'd overlooked before. By the time evening came, I had everything I needed to confront her, but I wasn't planning to do it alone. I made a call to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a private investigator I'd used during a messy business deal years ago. His name was Lucas, and he was the best in the business. If anyone could help me unravel the truth and expose Claire and David for what they were, it was him. Lucas agreed to meet me the next morning, his voice calm and professional as he assured me he could handle the situation. I hung up the phone, my resolve hardening. This wasn't just about Claire anymore. This was about taking back control of my life, about making sure she and David couldn't hurt me, or anyone else, ever again. The next morning, I met with Lucas in a quiet cafe on the other side of town. He was just as I remembered, sharp-eyed, calm, and methodical. As I slid the folder of evidence across the table, he opened it with a practiced ease, flipping through the pages and scrolling through the digital files on the USB I'd handed him. He didn't say much at first, just nodded occasionally, his expression unreadable. Finally, he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, fixing me with a steady gaze. "This is solid," he said, his voice low and even. "It paints a clear picture, but I need more context. What do you want me to do with this?" I hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. "I want to expose them," I said finally. "Not just to me, but to everyone. They've humiliated me, disrespected me, and I'm not going to let them get away with it. I need this to end." Lucas nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "All right, here's what we'll do. I'll dig deeper, follow them, gather more evidence, and see if there's anything else they're hiding. In the meantime, you need to keep playing it cool. Don't let them know you're onto them. The more comfortable they feel, the more careless they'll become." I agreed, though the thought of pretending everything was fine made my stomach churn. Still, I knew Lucas was right. If I wanted to bring them down, I had to be patient. Over the next week, Lucas kept me updated with his findings. It turned out David had a long history of manipulating people, using his charm to exploit their trust. He wasn't just Claire's brother. He was a predator, preying on her vulnerabilities and pushing her into situations that benefited him. But the real shock came when Lucas uncovered David's financial records. He'd been funneling money out of Claire's accounts for months, using it to fund his lavish lifestyle and cover up his own indiscretions. I felt a surge of anger and disgust as I stared at the evidence Lucas had compiled. Claire wasn't just cheating on me. She was being used by her own brother, and she didn't even realize it. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible, but it also gave me a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about exposing David for the liar and manipulator he was and making sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. With Lucas's help, I put the final pieces of the plan into place. The culmination would happen at David's next party, a gathering he'd invited us to under the guise of reconnecting as a family. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I accepted the invitation without hesitation. It was the perfect opportunity to confront them both in front of their closest friends and allies. The night of the party, I dressed carefully, choosing a suit that made me feel confident and in control. As Claire and I arrived at David's house, I couldn't help but feel a sense of grim anticipation. The house was packed, the air buzzing with laughter and conversation. David greeted us at the door, his usual charm on full display. He pulled Claire into a hug, his smile widening as he turned to me. "Mark," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, forcing a smile. Inside, the atmosphere was lively, but I couldn't shake the tension building in my chest. I watched as David flitted from guest to guest, his charm working overtime as he basked in the attention. Claire stayed close to him, laughing at his jokes and sipping her wine like nothing was wrong. But I could see the cracks beneath the surface, the way her smile faltered when she thought no one was looking, the way she avoided meeting my eyes. She knew something was coming, even if she didn't know what. As the night wore on, I bided my time, waiting for the perfect moment. Finally, when the room was full and the conversations were flowing, I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "David," I said, my tone calm but firm, "mind if I say a few words?" He looked at me, surprised, but nodded with a grin. "Of course, Mark. The floor is yours." I turned to face the room, my heart pounding as I held up my phone. "I'd like to share something with all of you. A little insight into the man we're here to celebrate tonight." I tapped the screen, and the room fell silent as the footage began to play. The video from the security camera filled the screen, the images sharp and damning. Claire and David, caught in the act, their betrayal laid bare for everyone to see. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as the video played on, the truth unraveling in front of their eyes. Claire's face went pale, her wine glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. David's expression hardened, his charm replaced by a cold, calculating anger. "Mark," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "what the hell are you doing?" "Exposing the truth," I said, my voice steady. "You think you can manipulate people, use them for your own gain, and get away with it? Not anymore." The room erupted into chaos, guests shouting and pointing as the full scope of David's betrayal came to light. Claire tried to speak, her voice trembling as she stumbled over her words, but I didn't give her the chance. "Save it," I said, my gaze fixed on her. "I'm done listening to your lies." I turned and walked out, the weight of the betrayal finally lifting as I left the house behind. When I walked away from that house, I left everything behind. Claire, David, the betrayal, all of it. It was as if the weight I'd been carrying for weeks finally dropped, leaving me lighter than I'd felt in years. I didn't care about what they said or did after that night. I had no interest in their apologies, explanations, or excuses. For the first time, I realized I didn't need closure from them. The only person who could give me closure was me. I moved out of our house a week later. It wasn't out of spite or anger. It just didn't feel like home anymore. Every corner of that place held memories of a life that didn't exist anymore, and I couldn't bear to stay there. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, nothing fancy but cozy enough to feel like a fresh start. At first, the silence was overwhelming. I wasn't used to being alone, and the absence of Claire's voice, her laughter, her presence, felt like a gaping hole in my life. But over time, I started to see it differently. The silence wasn't a void. It was a canvas, waiting for me to fill it with something new. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects and diving into tasks I'd neglected for years. The focus and structure were exactly what I needed. But it wasn't just about work. I wanted to rebuild myself, not just my career. I started waking up early to go for runs, the crisp morning air clearing my mind and energizing me for the day ahead. I signed up for a gym membership, something I'd been putting off for years, and found solace in the steady rhythm of lifting weights and pushing myself harder each day. I also began exploring hobbies I'd long forgotten. Photography had been a passion of mine in college, but I'd let it fall by the wayside as life got busier. Now, I dusted off my old camera and started taking photos of anything and everything. The city skyline at dusk, the vibrant colors of the farmer's market, the quiet beauty of a rainy afternoon. It reminded me that there was still so much beauty in the world, even after everything I'd been through. Over time, I started to meet new people, not in the forced, awkward way of trying to replace what I'd lost, but in a natural, organic way that felt refreshing. I joined a local photography group, where I connected with others who shared my love for capturing moments. I also started attending community events, art shows, charity runs, open mic nights. Each experience added a new layer to my life, filling the gaps with color and energy. Claire reached out a few times, her messages ranging from apologetic to defensive. I read them but never responded. I didn't hate her. I'd moved past that. But I didn't need her in my life, and I wasn't interested in revisiting the past. David, unsurprisingly, didn't bother contacting me. He'd always been too proud to admit when he was wrong, and I doubted that would ever change. One night, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment, looking out over the city lights, I realized how far I'd come. The pain of the betrayal had dulled, replaced by a quiet strength that I hadn't known I possessed. I was no longer defined by what had happened to me or by the people who had hurt me. I was defined by what I was building, by the choices I was making every day to create a life that was mine and mine alone. There were still hard days, of course, moments when the memories crept back in, uninvited and unwelcome. But those moments didn't define me anymore. They were just fleeting shadows, reminders of a past that no longer had power over me. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for the future, for the possibilities that lay ahead, for the person I was becoming. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. And that was the greatest revenge of all. Months turned into a year, and the transformation in my life was undeniable. I'd shed the weight of the betrayal, and with it, I'd found a version of myself that felt stronger, more focused, and freer than I had been in years. My new routine became second nature. Early mornings spent running through the park, evenings spent either at the gym or working on photography projects that had now grown into a small side business. I was finally living for myself, and it felt incredible. My apartment had become a sanctuary. What had once been a simple, functional space now reflected who I was. The walls were decorated with my photographs, vivid landscapes, candid city shots, and moments of quiet beauty. A small shelf held the books I'd rediscovered during my journey, stories that reminded me of resilience and growth. The place felt alive, warm, and unapologetically mine. One afternoon, as I was editing photos in my living room, a notification popped up on my phone. It was a message from an unknown number, and when I opened it, my chest tightened. It was Claire. "Hi, Mark. I know it's been a while, but I wanted to reach out. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I hope you're doing okay." I stared at the screen, a flood of emotions rushing over me. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was something quieter, more reflective. I thought about how those words might have crushed me months ago, how they might have reignited the pain I'd worked so hard to leave behind. But now, they felt like an afterthought. Her apology didn't change anything, didn't undo what had been done, but it also didn't have power over me anymore. I didn't reply. That evening, I joined a photography meetup downtown, a monthly event where local photographers gathered to share their work and exchange ideas. It had become one of my favorite events, a place where I felt truly connected to a community of like-minded people. As I mingled with the group, a woman caught my eye. She was standing near a display of portraits, her dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders, her smile warm and inviting. She looked up and caught me staring, and instead of looking away, she smiled wider. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, nodding toward one of the photos. "It is," I said, walking over to join her. "But I think you outshine it." She laughed, a soft, genuine sound that made me feel at ease. "I'm Olivia," she said, extending a hand. "Mark," I replied, shaking her hand. We talked for hours that night, losing track of time as the event wound down around us. She was a writer, a traveler, someone who understood the world in ways I hadn't expected. Her stories were vivid, her passion infectious, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark. Our connection grew quickly, but it wasn't rushed. Olivia and I took our time, getting to know each other over long walks, shared meals, and late-night conversations. She didn't ask about my past, and I didn't feel the need to explain it. She saw me for who I was now, not for who I had been, and that was more than enough. By the time a year had passed since my separation from Claire, I barely thought about her. My life had become rich with meaning, filled with moments of joy and growth that I never could have imagined in those dark days after the betrayal. One day, as Olivia and I sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sunset, she turned to me and smiled. "You're different, you know," she said softly. Different how? I asked, curious. Lighter, she said, reaching for my hand. Like you've let go of something heavy. I nodded, her words sinking in. She was right. I had let go of the pain, the anger, the need for closure. I'd let go of the person I used to be, and in doing so, I'd found someone new. And for the first time, I was truly happy.